In this message tonight, we are actually going to start looking at the translations. We have been now 10 to 12 messages, I think, introducing the subject of Bible translations and looking at basically a theory of translation. That should be rather revolutionary in your mind's eye of your conception of Bibles and the Bible translations.
Amen.
As much as I would like to stay on that, I think we need to move on. More could be said on that, there's no doubt about it, but I think we've given you a basis for an understanding of the subject of Bible translations, what makes a good one, what makes a bad one, and so forth. So we're going to come historically to the actual translations, and this will wrap up this study in biblical literature. Wrap it up, that is, I'm sure, in many, many months. Now we're going to look first of all at the ancient translations. That's where we're going to begin this evening. We'll work our way up into those that are more modern. And I'm sure that particularly our study beginning next week and onward from that for a period of time, I don't know exactly how long, will be a little more difficult than whenever we get far out into the future and we start looking at the modern translations, because it can be rather tedious and rather technical here with these old translations. At least half, if not more, of what we're going to do this evening will be a little bit of review, because some of these translations we've talked about before. And furthermore, besides just dividing it up into the ancient translations and those of more recent years, we're also going to begin, first of all, looking at specifically translations of the Old Testament. We're not going to get into looking at translations of the New Testament as such, because the New Testament almost fits in a different category. Whenever you are talking about the translation of the New Testament, then the odds are the Old was translated along with that. But whenever you're talking about the translation of the Old, sometimes, especially in earlier days, that is before the New Testament was written, and in modern times, if we're talking about a Jewish publication society, we're talking about strictly the translation of the Old and not the New. We are on the outline. I don't know exactly how long we'll be on it, but you can follow along for a short period of time anyway there on the outline. Probably half of the study tonight at least we will be there. Let's start off with a couple of test questions. This isn't on the outline, but to check your own knowledge or your speculative abilities. Translations of the Old and the New. We did this back whenever we introduced Bible translations and asked questions like what was the earliest printed version, in which language and so forth. So let's do that for the Old and for the New Testament. Just in your mind's eye, what was the receptor language? You don't have to speak out loud. We're going to get into this. What was the receptor language for the first translation of the Old Testament? It's written in Hebrew, so that's the original language. And what was the receptor language for the first time it was translated? Greek? Latin? English? No one has said English. King James English? The New Testament. The first receptor language. Latin, into which the New Testament. It was written originally in what? The New Testament. Greek. We would think Greek anyway. Maybe there were some sayings, short sayings that went around in Aramaic to begin with, but we'll stay with Greek for now, and we'll explain that more later on. And so you're saying what, Latin? But that's what some of you said for the Old Testament then. So you're putting it all together, Latin. Well, we'll go along, we'll answer that. Looks like we'll answer both of those tonight. Let's start with the Old Testament then. That's where we're going to be for a while. Tonight and maybe next week, maybe beyond that, I don't know. First of all, let's ask ourselves the question, why we have the need for the translation of the Old Testament. Several reasons have been suggested, and these are viable reasons as to why the Old Testament had to be translated. Now, for a long period of time, there was no need for translation. For more than a half a millennium, there was really no need for a translation, because the language that the Hebrew people spoke was Hebrew, and there was no change in that. There was no change in the people. There was no change in their location. There was no change in their religion. They had new material, new revelation given from the Lord to the prophets, and then through the prophets or by the writing of the prophets to the people. It stayed in Hebrew because there was no need to change. But as time went along, various reasons did arise that necessitated the change of the Old Testament scriptures from Hebrew to something else. First of all, we have the change of popular language spoken by the people that would obviously at least set in motion. Whether it gives us a translation or not is another question that we'll get into here in a moment, but at least would set in motion the present or eventual need for the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament to be translated. A change of the popular language. You remember that the returning exiles from Babylonian captivity gradually replaced Hebrew with Aramaic as their general, common, spoken dialect. And so that would bring the need for a Bible which the people could read. Later on, through the conquests of Alexander the Great, so we have the 5th century and we have the 4th century now, important things are taking place. For the conquest of Alexander and the spread of the Greek language, it brought a need for a Greek translation. So that gives us right away the need for the people to be able to read the scriptures both in Aramaic and in Greek. Or let's say at least understand them. If people are going to not read but have it read to them or preached to them, then it would have to be in Aramaic and then later in Greek and or Greek in order for them to understand. So you have to consider these things to consider in the first place, why would we ever have the origin for the need of a translation of the Bible? That is Hebrew, the Old Testament. That's where we're staying right now. Then in the second place, we have the subject of the diaspora. First of all, we have a change of the popular language. Returning exiles replaced Hebrew with Aramaic, and then in some sections of the world, Aramaic with Greek. Two reasons there, and then under this second reason, the diaspora, the dispersion, that is, of the Jewish community. And we have a twofold thing to consider here as well. First of all, we have the Babylonian diaspora, and more importantly, and later in history, we have the crucial Roman diaspora. So this is kind of tying in with what we're studying in the intertestamental period, where Rome is coming on the scene as being the maiden of the Mediterranean world. So the Jewish community following the Babylonian exile was spread out to many parts of the Mesopotamian world. Not the Mediterranean world, but the Mesopotamian world. And it would have brought a need for the people, since they're going into a new area outside of Palestine, and probably in that new area, they're picking up a new dialect there, a new language. Probably the elders, the religious figures in the community, wherever they would have been spread out, would have maintained the ability to read and to speak Hebrew, but for the common person that would not have been true. And then secondly, after the Roman destruction of the city and the nation, we don't think of it so much as Roman exile. When we speak of Babylonian exile, we know what we're talking about. But this is the greatest diaspora that the Jews had ever experienced. And proof of that can be seen in the fact it took them from then, AD 70, until just recently, the end of the 19th century, to get back into their land. With the Babylonian captivity, it just took a period of 70 years. And a large number of them, returning exiles, 50,000, and then more after that, but 50,000 under Zerubbabel, according to Ezra 1, go back to Palestine. With the destruction of the temple, well, that was done during Nebuchadnezzar's reign and the rule of Babylon. But with the destruction of the temple under the Romans, and really the people cease in their identity, the Jewish people cease in their national identity as being identified with the land of Judea and with the land of Palestine. Then we have not so much Roman exile, they were taken to Rome in exile, but the diaspora. They're spread out all over the Mediterranean world this time. And they were spread out to such a degree that they didn't come back. And it's taken almost 2,000 years for them to come back to Israel. Well, my point in saying this is that they obviously would have picked up the local language of the area into which they went and where they settled. Sometimes it could have been Greek, sometimes it could have been Aramaic, but there obviously would have been many times it would have been neither of those, neither Aramaic nor Greek. So we're not talking there about the first point, just the change of popular language, but now the diaspora. They're spread over into the Parthian Empire, and so they speak an entirely different dialect. The Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire were kind of the two empires vying for world control. Rome won only because the emphasis of civilization had shifted westwardly, and that takes us over into the Mediterranean world, and it leaves the old, decadent civilizations of the Fertile Crescent. And the Parthians came on the scene after that, and you'll hear more about them in the class on intertestamental period as well, where they pretty much control everything over by Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and Rome controls everything west of that. So there are a lot of Jews that have ended up in the Parthian Empire. There are a lot of Jews who have ended up in the various provinces of Asia Minor, like Bithynia and Galatia and Pontus and Cappadocia. And you would have Greek spoken there, obviously, because in many places there, because of the conquest of Alexander the Great. But there would be local dialects there. And the people would have to learn that to be able to live in that region and communicate with the people. And what about the reading of the Scriptures? Only for X number of years, only for a certain period of time, could they continue to go to the synagogue if you've got 10 men there in the community, or however you're going to get the Word of God, and go and have it done, read in Aramaic, Greek, or Hebrew. Only for so long would that last, until over a period of the change of one generation to the next, those children or those grandchildren or those great-grandchildren will pick up that local dialect. And therefore, again, it would necessitate the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into the local dialect. And then thirdly, why the need for the Old Testament to be translated? Thirdly, because of the explosive results of Christianity. A change of the language, the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish community following the Babylonian and particularly the Roman periods of captivity. And thirdly, Christianity. With this movement spreading to every nation under heaven, then the Old Testament, as well as later the New, would have to be translated. Or we really could even say, we're thinking Old Testament now, that's where our train of thought is. We really could say the New Testament and then later the Old would need to be translated into the language of the people. Why reverse it like that? Well, because the Christians were much more concerned about the gospel accounts, the historical accounts of the life and the ministry and the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ than they were about the Old Testament. You've got to remember that Christianity is going to be spread outside of the narrow-sighted confines of Judaism, which is, for the most part, the stronghold is certainly right there in Palestine, in Judea, more than just Palestine, in Judea. So we're talking about Gentiles being converted under Christianity. So we're talking about people who could care less about Methuselah, Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah. They've never heard of people like that. Now, for the Jews, that would be important. For the Jewish Christians, for the Jewish believers, that would be important. They would have to be convinced in their mind that all of these truths and all of this revelation, all of this so-called light now that we are experiencing under Christianity, that it is substantiated according to the law and the prophets. They knew enough to know that God's not going to come and just wipe out everything as though that was never His plan to begin with. It all tied in. They saw that the predictions of the Old Testament were fulfilled in this carpenter from Galilee. And because they saw that, then the Old Testament to them took on a new light, as well as the New, but the Old Testament would have taken on a new light. For we Gentiles, notice how we have to be instructed in the Old Testament. That's not part of our heritage. Of course, the New today, because we're removed in history and culture 2,000 years, the New is not a part of our culture or our history either. But I would say the Old that much more. The New gets a little closer to times than the patriarchal narratives back in the Pentateuch, particularly back in the book of Genesis. So you got various customs and events going on there that, well, for a Gentile mind, even if it's first century A.D. and how much more 20th century A.D. would be a little bit difficult to grasp. So Christianity is spreading everywhere, introducing, we would say, a new form of religion For the Jewish Christian, it would be the fulfillment of the old form of religion, new light cast on the old darkness, moving out of the shadows and into the light. And it would make all the difference in the world for them to have both the old and the new, or for the Christian, both the new and then later the old translated. Now, let me ask you another question before moving on, or another series of two. Whenever the Old Testament was translated from one language to another, let me preface it with a few remarks here. I think that with so many things, such as Bible translations, the King James Version in general, people have such incredibly naive notions about things. And you talk about the translation of the Old Testament, and we, myself, unless you're educated otherwise, only type of Old Testament we can picture is one that runs from Genesis to Malachi. I mean, in that biblical order as well, the English order of the Bible from Genesis to Malachi. We think of translation of the Old Testament, that means a translation of every book there. No, not necessarily. That would be very rare to begin with. That would be very rare to ever happen. It would be difficult. We gave you the statistics when we first began this little sub-series on Bible translations concerning when and what portions of the Bible are translated, even today. Whenever the Bible is translated, generally it's part of the New Testament. And it's not the whole New Testament. It's one book here, one book there, then another book before you get the whole thing. So going back to my question, when the Old Testament was translated from one language to another, what part of the Old Testament canon was translated first? Oh, definitely the law. Definitely the law. You see, they would have to work on the law first. It's no easy thing to sit down and in 24 hours have it all done. And so you're not going to even think about the whole Old Testament, but the law is the heart, is the basis of the whole Old Testament. So give us the heart of it, and if we have any sense at all, we can kind of fill out the preaching of the prophets later on. Of course, it helps to have that later on, and helps to have the poetic aspect of the Old Testament in Job and Psalms, and the wisdom teaching as well, but that will come later. Okay, question number 2, for the New Testament. Whenever it was translated, what was translated first? The Gospels, definitely. As a matter of fact, you'll find in this study as we go along here, many times for a number of years, the Gospel would be the only things translated. I say the Gospel singular, it's because it was one story about him. All of the application of the Apostle Paul, particularly, of course, Paul is known for filling out the Old Testament. All of the filling out of that, or the application of that, would kind of be secondary as far as the early Christians were concerned. That is, new converts were concerned, and would come later. Of course, that's why God had his apostles during the 1st century A.D. Because remember, we only have just a sampling of the material that was written. There were over 50 Gospels written, remembering we only have 4. I wonder how many epistles were written by the apostles to various churches. No idea. We have hints of some like Laodicea and so forth that we don't have in our canon, Colossians chapter 4. And just a hint like that would be enough of a hint to let me know that since we're talking about application, and people would think, well, you can have the gospel, but look at the problems that the saints at Corinth had with the truth of the gospel. Paul had to write and correct specifically all of these various problems. So why weren't those epistles translated that early? Well, that's just what I'm trying to say, that the apostles that were existing at that time would have, for the most part, kept a lot of these things corrected in various parts of the Christian world. It was taking time for Christianity to expand by means of her evangelism and her efforts of evangelism. So the apostles would keep a lot of that corrected. But what the Christians wanted to know was the basic account, not divorce and remarriage, but the basic account of who is this man that I'm supposed to be following and serving and that died for me on a cross somewhere? Who is this man? What is the story about him? Where was he born? Was it like the Greek and the Roman myths? Did he just come out of heaven? Did he spring from the side of the head of Zeus? Or what's the historical, the background for this whole account? And to learn that is to give them some substance to their Christianity. And then, of course, it's going to produce problems as you try to live and to walk all of that without a knowledge of how all of these certain things apply. Let me give you one example how that seems to have worked out. And just this one statement that I'm going to make would profoundly influence one's doctrine in this area. Let's take the subject of divorce and remarriage. I brought that up specifically then. If you look over in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, look at two passages, the Matthew 5 and the Matthew 19. Matthew 5:31. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, except for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Now that's rather plain, is it not? But it's rather short as well. It's extremely short. We could even make it stronger than that. It's too short to answer the complex situation of divorce and remarriage. If you go over to Matthew chapter 19, it's a little longer of an account, but the stress of it is essentially the same. Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12. The last three of those verses get into a discussion between Jesus and his disciples, but the first 9 of those, the question that the Pharisees brought to him concerning divorce and remarriage. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every or for any cause? And he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, it's for this cause a man shall leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and these two shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more two, but one. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Well, that's what they were hoping that he would more or less say, so that they could say, well, then why then did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? In other words, they're saying, you are saying that divorce is not allowed, that two are to become one. And then if we have divorce, then two became one, and then one became two again. So they said, you're saying that two becomes one, that means no divorce. Then why did Moses give this commandment for the bill of divorcement? And he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. That's what we call a theocratic concession there. They're difficult to deal with, and you have to deal with it in ethics, and that's where we mentioned that term before. It's a theocratic concession that's made. Otherwise, we end up with the problem of the altering of the essential will and plan of God. And God clearly says that he's the Lord God and he does not change. So his mind, his attitude, his will, his purpose does not change. So if he doesn't change, how can we have a change here? Well, to help ourselves, of course, the critics would say this is not valid, but you have to come up with some answer. You could have the answer of the higher school of criticism that Moses was wrong back when he said that. Notice Jesus doesn't say that he was wrong. He said Moses allowed you because Moses was wrong, because your hearts were hard. He puts the blame on the nation of Israel and not on the lawgiver of Israel. So you have to invent something to work yourself out of a sticky situation here, and theologians call it a theocratic concession. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. So if you take Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 together, then what we have is divorce is allowed under one and only one situation, and that's fornication. Well, then if you want to go over to 1 Corinthians 7, I don't think we'll get into reading the verses, but we'll point them out to you. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 8 through 28. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 8 to 28. Keeping all of this in mind and hoping you can remember why and where and how we got off on this tangent, then it will affect one's understanding of divorce and remarriage for the better or for the worse, whether or not you're willing to say that 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is a filling out of the gospel teaching on divorce and remarriage. If you're not willing to say that, then all you can end up with is Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. That would mean that Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 say the same thing as 1 Corinthians 7, and the latter says the same thing as, and no more than the former two, Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. So it depends on what a person's position is. And what your position is about what I just said will affect, for better or for worse, one's view of divorce and remarriage. So we're talking about the filling out by the apostles of the germ of truth that's found back in the Gospels. That seems just to be, why have all the epistles if all they're doing is repeating what the Gospels said? Why even have all the epistles in? It seems like we have the epistles, we have the apostolic teaching of the early church, because it is teaching the teachings of Christ, but it's a filling out. It's putting more meat on the bones as well. Now, maybe for some weak-hearted but staunch literalist evangelical, he would like to say, well, it's almost as though you are implying that the teaching of Jesus was not enough, and so it looks like it's a slight against our Lord. But that's not how it's intended, and that's not how it was intended by the apostles in their writing such instructions as this long 40-verse chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 had said it all, there'd be no need for 1 Corinthians 7. So anyway, getting back to, that's just an illustration to prove the point of what I'm discussing now, that the Gospels would definitely have been the first things of the New Testament translated. The epistles would have followed that probably much later, and meanwhile, to correct any situations of misunderstanding or misapplication of the teaching of the Gospels, we would have the Word as well as the spoken Word as well as the epistles, the written Word of the apostles of the first century. In other words, I'm proving in my own mind, and I hope I'm proving to you, a whole lot of things in what I'm saying right now. I'm proving why there was such a need for the apostles in the first century that would cease to exist after that time. That's a good argument. It's a difficult one. It's a more technical and more scholarly one that you have to know something about Bible translations to end up with, or you end up just with the charismatic notion, well, God set them in the church, and as long as the church is here, they are here. Well, there are more things to consider than that. There's much more going on than one little verse and memorizing one little way to repeat that one little verse, so you end up with the fact that you've got a next-door neighbor on one side that's an apostle, on the other that's a prophet. We would say they're probably two deceived people who wish they were an apostle or who wish they were a prophet. But anyway, I see a very real need for the apostles to keep things going, keep things straight, until we have time for everything to be translated. And then that would depend upon one's view of the sufficiency of Scripture. If you believe that Scripture covers what we need to have it covering for us, even in this modern society in which we live, then that would rule out the need for the apostles to continue past a certain period of time. Okay, so that answers the question, why? Why would we have the need for a translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into whatever other language? Now we're going to get into three different groups of languages. We're going to do this for the Old Testament, and then for the New it will be much more exhaustive. For the Old Testament, the translation work can be studied under three group headings. For the Old Testament translation work, we can study this under three group headings as representative of the three initial languages into which the Old Testament in Hebrew was translated. Okay, group 1, Aramaic. Now, nobody said Aramaic when I said what was the first receptor language for the Old Testament. Aramaic. We've already discussed this before, but all you could probably think of, well, some of you are saying Latin. Latin, my word, we're talking about years later. German, English, even Greek, we're talking about hundreds of years after the time we're talking about with Aramaic. What are we talking about under Aramaic? We're talking about the Targumim. Remember, we've discussed the Targumim before. Let's go over to the book of Nehemiah. Or English, you can spell it Targums. That's the way we would say it in English. We pluralize things by putting an S on the end. Targums. That's the way you have it for you on your outline, probably. The Targums. Nehemiah chapter 8, it's probably verse 8, but we need some more along with that. You need really way back to verse 1 through verse 8. Verse 8 is kind of just the conclusion here. Now, the Targumim, or the Targums, remember they were paraphrased translations. They were translations. They were done orally to begin with, passed down orally, and then committed to writing. These were paraphrased translations from the Hebrew into Aramaic for the returning exile, seen as early as Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, it just so happens that it's possible that we could have very small portions of this written down as early as the time when we are speaking, that is Ezra and Nehemiah, the end of the 5th century BC. We've given you on, let's see, I think I've got this marked down, Lit tapes 95 and 96. I'm going to give you some cross-references as we go along. Not that you need to hear those tapes again, but just so you have your notes complete. Lit tapes 95 and 96 entitled The Aramaic Targumim, Part 1 and Part 2. We've given you on those tapes very detailed information about the Targumim and specific dates for the codified form, that is the written form of the oral Targums, the oral Aramaic Targums as they had been passed down. But one thing I probably need to mention tonight in light of what we're saying about translations and Aramaic coming first and coming the earliest is that it's certainly possible to have very, very small portions of the law. Remember, they're reading the law of Moses here. They're not reading Ezra or Nehemiah. They are living the book of Nehemiah here. So they are reading from and they're reading about the law. And it's possible, it only makes sense that although we're not going to have it in its final codified form, that's the official recognized Targum on this book or Targum on that book or Targum on this section, the poetical writings, the prophets, or the Pentateuch, we could still have a small portion, like maybe Exodus 20, the Decalogue there, or maybe Exodus 24 on in the Book of the Covenant there, or maybe some of the exhortations from the 3 sermons of Moses on the plains of Moab in the book of Deuteronomy, maybe one of his sermons or 2 of his sermons, or an excerpt from one or the other of those 3 sermons, written down at this time in Aramaic as a Targum. It's a paraphrased, kind of free, but a paraphrased translation, which means that Aramaic would be the earliest receptor language. So let's start with verse 1. All the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate. They spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. So they're living Nehemiah, not writing it, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and women, and all that could hear with understanding, upon the 1st day of the 7th month. And he read therein before the street that was before the water gate from the morning until midday, before the men, the women, and those that could understand. And the ears of all the people were attentive unto the book of the law. Skipping all the way down to the end of verse 7. These liturgical individuals here calls the people to understand the law, and the people stood in their place. So they read, here's kind of a summation, verse 8 of the first 7 verses. So they read in the book of the law of God distinctly, and gave the sense, and caused them to understand the reading. Now, if they were reading in the book of the law was written in Hebrew, so they're reading in Hebrew. Then why read distinctly and give the sense and cause them to understand the reading if they can understand Hebrew? Now, one argument is, well, it was, they were preaching about this. They'd read it in Hebrew and everyone could understand Hebrew, and then you'd preach a little sermon and say, now this is how God wants us to apply this today. But I don't think you'll find most scholars that know anything about what's going on here who would recognize something like that, although the NIV Study Bible has a negative comment on our interpretation of Nehemiah 8 and verse 8. But I'd have a negative comment on their comment about my comment about Nehemiah 8 and verse 8. I noticed that in reading that they are against, for some reason, it's one of the professors from University of Miami of Ohio, who's an expert in New Testament archaeology, of all things. He's an expert in New Testament archaeology. And he's commenting here on the 8th verse, as well as, I think, Ronald Youngblood, who's one of the co-editors, is on the staff, on the panel there of the whole Bible, that we don't have Aramaic Targums or Targumim being practiced here. That is the oral sense, and that's what we'd be arguing for here. If they gave the sense, it's not written down in Aramaic, they're giving the sense of it here. We're just saying it could have been written down a month later, a year later, or something, and it began to be practiced at that time. But they're saying we've got no evidence for Targumim existing this early. And I would say Nehemiah 8:8 is our evidence for Targumim existing this early. They're looking for evidence, but they're looking for evidence outside the Bible that will support this interpretation of this verse. And I don't see where you would need to look for any evidence, and the evidence, I would grant, would be very scant at this early date. You wouldn't need to look for any to support that because it's precisely what the verse says. They read in the book of the law of God distinctly, and they didn't preach from it, but they gave the sense of it and caused them to understand the reading. That is because they spoke Aramaic. And so they gave kind of a paraphrase translation of it into Aramaic. One, in other words, would stand up and read a sentence or so in Hebrew, and then someone would stand up and give it in a paraphrase translated form in Aramaic. So the Aramaic language would be the earliest, and it would only make sense for it to be the earliest since that's the language that the Old Testament people picked up first after Hebrew began to pass off the scene. So our first group is Aramaic, and really the only thing that we can place here are the Targumim. Our second group is Greek, the Greek language. Our second group would be the Greek language. And we'll have lots of points to put under this. Now, I don't really have anywhere else to put this, so I'm going to put it here just with this note on Greek. Maybe it should go before Aramaic or between Aramaic and Greek, but I'll put it here, and that is a comment on the Samaritan Pentateuch. Where are we going to place the Samaritan Pentateuch in all of this? Well, we're really not going to place it in all of this as a translation because it's not. It's in Hebrew. The Samaritan Pentateuch's in Hebrew. So it's not a version. It's not a translation. It's just a revised, from the point of view of the Samaritans, Hebrew Pentateuch. So because it's in Hebrew, it doesn't fit here with Bible translations. But since that is something rather significant that we have discussed earlier, I thought I needed to make a point about that. It's not a version, but it's revised Hebrew. That is, theologically, it's revised from the point of view of Jews who have, through the Lord's Word, designated Mount Zion as the chief religious and political place in Israel. And they revised that to, of course, say Mount Gerizim. Okay, so under Greek, some of you were guessing Greek, and I can understand why, because the first thing that would come to your mind is the LXX, the Septuagint. And that's the first thing to place here under Greek. And you could even argue for that point of view that, well, our earliest complete, full, known, substantiated, cannot be denied translation from the Hebrew to some other language would be into Greek, and that would be in the Septuagint, and you would have a point there. So the Septuagint translated from the 3rd to the 1st century BC. Again, the common misconception is the Septuagint was just a book that people sat down and wrote. They read the Hebrew or had the Hebrew read to them and translated it into Greek. And that happened over a period of about 7 hours or something, or a week or a month or something. No, probably as early as 250 BC, the mid-3rd century BC, the Pentateuch was translated in Alexandria, Egypt. And over the process of anywhere from 100 to 150 years, that would go from 250 down to either 150 or 100 BC, the so-called prophets and writings would have been translated. For this, you can see lit tapes 51 and 52, or your notes there for lit 51 and 52. Entitled The Samaritan Pentateuch and Septuagint, and then lit 52, the Septuagint version. Now it's a primary translation, which makes it a what, according to our technical terms we discussed? a version, which makes it a version. The Septuagint's a primary translation, which makes it a version. The Targumim would be primary as well. They go straight from Hebrew right to Aramaic. Straight from Hebrew right to Greek in the Septuagint makes it a primary translation. You don't have any middle language. You go from the original to the receptor language, or it would make it a version. Okay, then secondly, we're just discussing the earliest Old Testament translations. You see, all of this sets in motion the whole business of the translating of the Scriptures. And that's why we can read the Bible in English today. Somewhere along the line, something had to be set in motion. And with these different translations that I'm giving you now, these you can fit under different reasons that we've discussed earlier. Why have the need to translate from Hebrew to some new language for the Old Testament? Well, a change of the popular language. A change of the popular language. That would answer for Targumim right away. It would answer for the Septuagint in Greek right away because the language was changed, but it would also answer something else. It would be the diaspora. They were dispersed from Palestine down to Alexandria, Egypt. So that would fit under that second reason that we've given earlier. So coming to a second Greek translation, that of Aquila. Aquila's was done around AD 130. Aquila, of the three that come right after the Septuagint, was the slavishly literal word for word of the three. The slavishly literal Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and it quickly became the official Bible for non-Christian Jews. Lit tape 53. It quickly became the official Bible for non-Christian Jews. Why was that true? They didn't like the Septuagint, the Jews, the non-Christian Jews. Why didn't they? Because the Christians took over the use of the Septuagint. And that had been the Jewish Bible for all of the Greek-speaking Jews throughout that part of the world. But when the Christians took over their Bible, the Septuagint, and started proving from their Bible messianic fulfillment of messianic prophecies, it gave them a lot of problems. So you have to drop your Bible. It's like if somebody uses your version to prove something's not really there. Well, I don't like that version anymore then. I'm going to drop the KJV. It doesn't have all the things I want it to have in there, so I'll go to another one. It's precisely what they did. So we've discussed that in a lot of detail before. Yes, that's exactly right. The Christians adopted the LXX, and so the Jews gave it up. And they had to have something in its place, and Aquila gave them something, AD 130, right after the introduction of Christianity, about 100 years now. He gave them something for the non-Christian Jews now to use, where the passages is so slavishly literal that you don't get the good messianic flavor in some parts, and important parts, like Isaiah 7:14, that you'll find over in the LXX. It's a primary translation as well. It's primary, or version, Aquila's. Since we've discussed primary, secondary, and tertiary, we're just throwing this in for completeness sake. Primary. Okay, in the third place, we have that of Theodotion. 40 years after Aquila's translation. Theodotion, AD 170. Now, Theodotion's was a revision of some earlier Greek text. And just what that text is, we don't really know. Scholars are divided over the text identity that was used by Theodotion. Whether it was the LXX, that was an earlier Greek text, or Aquila's, by 40 years, that was an earlier Greek text, or some mysterious and at this time unknown third choice beyond the LXX and Aquila. It depends on, and it's difficult to say since we don't know what text he really is using. What we have here is probably a revision then. It could either be primary or secondary, just depending on the degree to which Theodotion went in basing his writing on this earlier Greek text, or getting back to Hebrew manuscripts and simply working his way through that Greek text back to Hebrew. Probably it would make it a secondary translation, though. Now, from the 4th century A.D. onwardly, Christians used his text for the book of Daniel. We've discussed that a little before. This is Lit Tape 53. You can find this on. Christians used his text for Daniel and not the LXX. The Theodosian text of Daniel, in other words, was more agreeable to 4th century onwardly Christians than was that provided by the Septuagint. And some of the reasons behind that, all of the reasons behind that we don't know at this date, but some of the reasons behind that you can go back to find out on Lit Tape 53. Then in the 4th place we have Symmachus. Symmachus, 10 years after Theodosian, 50 after Aquila, A.D. 180. Produced a primary translation which was a very smooth reading in Greek of the Old Testament. The same tape, Lit Tape 53, entitled Greek Versions of the Old Testament. Goes into New Testament papyri, but specifically the first part, Greek versions of the Old Testament. Jerome said that Aquila translates word for word. Symmachus gives the sense, and Theodosian differs slightly from the LXX. It's a quote from Jerome about these 3 versions, Aquila, Theodosian, and Symmachus. He said, Aquila's gives it to us word for word. Symmachus gives us a sense, and Theodosian departs only slightly from the LXX, which would seem to imply that the text behind Theodosian's Greek text would have been the LXX. That can't be proven, and from a study, in some places it seems like it's not true, but with Jerome living much earlier than any textual critics and scholars today, maybe we should take his word. Theodosian differs slightly from the LXX. Maybe that means Theodosian used the LXX, that he revised it and gave us his translation. Then in the 5th place, Greek translations of the Old Testament, our second group of languages, first Aramaic, then Greek. The 5th place, the Hexapla. This is a great masterpiece of Origen, the Hexapla. Now, Origen probably was one of the most brilliant minds of early Christianity, and this happens to be one of his most brilliant works as well. And the reason that he produced this parallels the reason for the origin of the Syriac Peshitta as well as the Latin Vulgate. Seems like all 3 of these things have the same common reason behind them, and it only makes sense, and of course we've seen that take place in recent years as well. And that is because of the great variety of texts that were available in his day. Because you've got so many different texts available in the Greek language, or for the Peshitta in the Syriac language, or for the Vulgate in the Latin language, then someone, Origen, Jerome, and whoever did the Peshitta, would come along and, because of the great variety of texts, try to reconcile all of this and give us something that's more uniform. Draw all of this together and give us something that's uniform. Well, it gets its name from its composition because it had 6 columns. This is the same tape, by the way, Lit Tape 53. We gave you an interesting account of this. It had 6 columns. Columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Under which the following text could be placed. Number 1, he had his available Hebrew text in the mid-3rd century A.D., 240 A.D., the Hebrew text before him. Then in the next column, column 2, he had a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew. Just a transliteration from a Hebrew letter to a Greek character. The 3rd column, he had Aquila's. In the 4th, he had Symmachus. In the last, he had Theodosian. And in the 5th, he had his own recension of the LXX. He had his own recension of the LXX. The Hebrew text, a Greek transliteration, Aquila's, Symmachus, his own recension of the LXX, and then that of Theodotion. So you see how many Greek texts we're ending up with now. The Septuagint, Aquila, Theodotion, which may be revised, the LXX, Symmachus. Then we've got, from Origen, his own recension of the LXX, probably more of a recension than a revision. Maybe Theodotion's was more of the latter than the former, a revision and not a recension. And so we've got various strains of LXX, Septuagint, texts before us, and not just one. There's not just a Septuagint that's just one big Bible that's on someone's coffee table at home. It's a certain family of variants that is found, a certain text family. But yet you've got variants within the text family. You've got the LXX. In other words, we've got three strains here. The LXX, possibly Theodotion's revision of it, and then definitely Origen's recension of it, which gives us three forms of LXX by the time we're into the mid-3rd century A.D. And then beyond the hexapla, that's number 5, numbers 6 and 7, not a lot is known about, and they're not that important, but Hesychius and Lucian. We just briefly mentioned these before, and I will even be more brief now. Hesychius, Hesychius and Lucian, Lucian, both of whom lived around AD 300. Lucian up in Antioch and Hesychius down in Egypt. And so let's say by around 300, then what we would have a Greek text from Hesychius that's probably controlling Christianity down in Egypt, a Greek text from Lucian that's controlling maybe up in the Antioch on the Orontes region, and then the text by Origen, which would control Palestine, Jerusalem, and Caesarea, since Caesarea was an important city in Origen's time. Okay, that's Aramaic with the Targumim. That's Greek from the Septuagint through Lucian. And then we come to our third group. By the way, if you haven't already recognized it, all of groups 1 and 2, this is just review because we've covered this in a lot more detail earlier. From this point onwardly, now it will all be new because we haven't ever gotten this far before. We had to discuss these Greek texts earlier when we were discussing the subject of textual criticism. Group 3 is Syriac. Syriac. Now, Syriac was a form of Aramaic. Some people even call it a Christian form, but I don't know if I would call it that. Syriac was a form of Aramaic. Now you've got Syriac or Syrian mentioned many times in the Old Testament, in the KJV, and it should be Aramean and Aramaic there. You do have Syriac as a language one time spelled with a K and not a C over in this funny passage in, Daniel 2:4. Daniel 2:4, you've got it ending with a K instead of a C. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, Syriack, instead of ending with a C as it should. And that should be Aramaic. So whenever I'm talking about Syriac now, I'm not talking about Aramaic. That was group 1. We're talking about a different language now. They are closely related, Aramaic and Syriac. But Aramaic is the larger of the two, and Syriac fits underneath Aramaic. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 4. Now to answer the second question that we began this evening with. What was the receptor language for the first translation of the New Testament? You want to guess now? Syriac. Definitely Syriac. Syriac And we'll get into this more next week. We're running out of time here within a few moments. More work was done in the early church with Syriac versions than with any other language. The churchmen in Syria, in Antioch, were some of the most important men in the first couple of centuries because of the brilliant work done in Bible translations. Syriac then becomes, as far as we're concerned, particularly with the New Testament, although we're still on the Old right now, becomes no doubt the most important language and therefore the most important versions because it's the earliest of the versions for the New Testament. Now, this whole question of the Syriac translation is extremely complicated. Just wait until we get into this. We won't do it tonight. We'll just introduce you to it tonight. But it's extremely complicated, and we have to deal with it first because it's the earliest known receptor language for a translation of the New Testament. But it also appears that the Old Testament was translated into Syriac. Well, it's definite that it was. The question is, which came first? Did Jews translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Syriac because they had been scattered up there in Syria? Or were the Christians the first one to take the New Testament into Syriac? And then, of course, they would have followed with the Old Testament as well, but it would have come later. For the Jews, it would have come only because they would not have done the New Testament after that. We've got today manuscripts, Syriac manuscripts from Lebanon. Talking about ancient manuscripts now, if you want to jot down these regions from Lebanon, this is how widespread they were. From Lebanon, Egypt, Sinai, Mesopotamia, Armenia, India, and even as far away as China. Now, we are going to look at such things as the Old Syriac. You're going to have to become familiar with these technical terms. That's capital O, capital S. This is a technical name, not just old like it's old-timey, but the old. That's the name. The Old Syriac version, and then you know how you put a parenthesis and put an S on the end of the word. That means we don't know whether it was a version, an Old Syriac version, or the Old Syriac versions. But that's capital O, capital S, Old Syriac. Now the Old Syriac would be comparable then to the Old Latin versions in its relation to the Vulgate as the Old Syriac stands to the Peshitta. That's something technical that we will have to get into a little more. The diatessaron of Tatian, all of this has to be discussed under the Syriac language. The diatessaron of Tatian, Diatessaron. I don't know if this is on the outline or not, but the diatessaron of Tatian, the Peshitta, and then later translations. We have as many as 5 to 6 versions in Syriac in the first 6 centuries of Christianity. Major important ones, such as Old Syriac, the Diatessaron, Peshitta, all the way up into, I think the last one is the Palestinian Syriac version. Okay, out of time. Let me just, right quickly, let me say this. Why is this such a difficult area? Reasons for difficulty. Reasons why the study of this Syriac family is going to be very difficult. Number one, because of the scant, obscure early references available. And all scholars, regardless of which position you end up with, whether a Jewish old or a Christian new then old position, which are the two positions we will have to discuss, the scant, obscure early references. In the second place, another reason for difficulty, multiple translations. Old Syriac versions, multiple translations in Syriac. A lot of work being done by the churchmen in Syria. And thirdly, and most importantly, the fact that we may be dealing with two different traditions. An Old Testament and a New Testament one, or you could say a Jewish and a Christian one. This is where opinion is divided. we may be dealing with two different traditions. The Jewish Old Testament one, the Christian New. In other words, what I mean by that is some people believe that the Old Testament in Syriac, the old Syriac version, was first made by the Jews in Syria who had need for a Bible they could read in the Syriac language. Then other people say, no, the first translation was done by the Christians in Syriac, and they gave us the New Testament. And then later, they would have given us the Old. So if we are dealing with two traditions, a Jewish gave us the Old, and then a Christian gave us the New, it's going to make it that much more difficult. So we'll get into the pros and the cons on that and see which one appears to be right beginning in the next teaching on this. Okay, I'll go over that again whenever we start next time, so don't worry about it right now. That just brings us up to date on discussion of Syriac translations.